Hi everyone, Jason here. So, in light of the recent Supreme Court events with Justice Kavanaugh, I wanted to talk a little bit about Mitch McConnell, and I wanted to talk about him in the context of being someone who has a big hand in hurting our democracy. And recently, he was even dubbed the gravedigger of democracy. The man that made that statement was Christopher Browning. It was in the context of an essay that he wrote called The Suffocation of Democracy that appeared in the New York Review of Books. So, Chris Browning is a historian, and he's known for his works on fascism, World War II, and specifically Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. He compares McConnell to a man named Paul von Hindenburg, a very powerful German politician, actually was the German president, who ended up appointing Hitler to be chancellor. So chancellor is the German equivalent of president, and Hindenburg, who was president, was more or less just a very powerful politician, but not at the top of the government. And this essay, The Suffocation of Democracy, makes a comparison between interwar Germany, so between World War I and World War II, and the modern day United States. So the purpose of this video is to summarize his essay more or less and add some analysis. Mostly I'm going to be focusing on McConnell and by proxy congressional Republicans and Hindenburg, the similarities that they have in how they've conducted politics and the similarities in enabling dangerous demagogic leaders. So first, let's start with the Weimar Republic. This is the German state during the interwar period. That's what it's known as, Weimar Germany. And it was supposed to be sort of a democratic experiment. So Browning writes this essay, and he talks about Paul von Hindenburg, the president, and his cooperation with Hitler, who becomes chancellor. And Hindenburg was supposed to be a defender of democracy, but instead he becomes the gravedigger, just like McConnell in Browning's analysis. So one of the main points made in this essay is hyperpolarization caused by Hindenburg was a huge factor in the rise of Nazism. Economic conditions also played a big role, but hyperpolarization is what I'm going to focus on because that's what most relates to Hindenburg and McConnell in modern day America. So this hyperpolarization that Hindenburg spurred on, it made parliamentary majorities impossible. And much like McConnell, conservatives, of which Hindenburg was one of them, they had a shrinking base of voters or of supporters. So instead of trying to negotiate further or things of that nature, Hindenburg appointed Hitler to rule by decree, sort of like to rule exclusively by executive orders. And Hindenburg and his allies thought that they could control Adolf Hitler while delivering policy wins. And they wanted to broaden the base that was shrinking through the popular support that Hitler enjoyed. So some of the policy goals for the conservatives and Hindenburg at the time were rearmament, so restocking their weapons after World War I, outlawing opposition parties, suspending freedom of speech, press, and assembly, and also purging civil service and labor unions. And the conservatives and Hindenburg, they were very pleased with their returns. But as we know, then, once in power, the Nazis took things to a whole other level. Then we transition to the modern day US, the Republican Party, and people like Mitch McConnell. He was also dubbed, as I said earlier, a gravedigger of democracy, akin to Hindenburg. And this is according to Browning. He makes that comparison. And so let's talk a little bit about hyperpolarization in terms of McConnell. So when Barack Obama became president, there was a lot of opposition to him in Congress, and McConnell and Senate Republicans blocked loads of nominations to lower courts and other positions, just blatantly obstructive. That's how they conducted themselves in regards to Barack Obama. They were so obstructive that it provoked the Dems, the Democrats, to scrap the filibuster for lower court appointments, but not for the Supreme Court. So for those who aren't aware, the filibuster is they moved it from needing 60 votes to 50 votes to get these people onto the courts, because at an unprecedented rate, McConnell and his colleagues were not allowing Obama to do things that any other president is just like allowed to do. So the Democrats, they scrapped the filibuster for all but the Supreme Court. And so then Merrick Garland gets nominated. I talk about this in one of my previous videos. And talk about hyperpolarization. Mitch McConnell refuses to hold hearings for nearly a year for Obama's pick of Merrick Garland. And this is a man that Obama specifically picked to try to come into the middle, and please Republicans enough that they wouldn't give him grief over it. I believe it was Orrin Hatch, who was one of a very senior Republican, who said, "Oh, Merrick Garland would make a fine Supreme Court judge," and then they refused to hold hearings for him. So then, when Trump became president, the Republicans and McConnell, they scrapped the filibuster for even Supreme Court nominees. And then they nominated Justice Gorsuch and completed the stolen seat of Garland, from Garland to Gorsuch. So to sort of summarize this point, he provoked the other side, as in McConnell, he provoked the other side by blocking tons of nominations to lower courts and other positions. He provoked the Democrats into having to actually scrap the filibuster. And then when it came time for the Republicans to be sort of the ruling party, they scrapped the filibuster of the Supreme Court nominee, and then they ended up stealing the seat of Garland, who they refused to hold hearings for in the first place. Then I'd like to transition to a quote that McConnell made, where he said, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for Obama to be a one-term president." He says this a couple years into Obama's first term. Notice how his single most important thing he wanted to achieve wasn't to create jobs for Kentuckians, wasn't to ensure health care for them, fix infrastructure, any of those things. It was for Obama to be a one-term president. So it's pretty polarizing, I'd say. However, there's a caveat. A lot of Democrats did jump on him, and some even took his quote a little bit out of context, but I don't really think it was too far from the truth, actually. He said, "I don't want the president to fail. I want him to change." So he was saying that he wants the president, and as in President Obama, to sort of meet him and his congressional colleagues in the middle, which that makes sense. That makes sense. But here's where I take issue. His complaint was, quote, "He spends too much, he taxes too much, he borrows too much." So I'll take each of those complaints and dissect them really quickly. He taxes too much. So when it came time for the Republicans to be the party in power, let's talk about taxes too much. It's true, the Republicans did pass tax cuts, but the cuts were for corporations, really. They cut taxes permanently for corporations, but when it came to cutting taxes for the middle class, Well, they only cut them for, I think it was somewhere between 5 and 10 years or something like that. Why not make it permanent? If he had such a complaint, such grievances about Obama, why only for the corporations is he making the tax cuts permanent? The Republican Party, why are they making the tax cuts permanent for the corporations, and yet only temporarily for the middle class? And to me, it seemed like something that was politically motivated, where you cut for a little bit taxes for the middle class for long enough that it can help them politically in the midterms and maybe even the next presidential election. But then when it comes time for Democrats to eventually regain power, people are saying, "Oh, where did my tax relief go?" But that's not nearly as hypocritical as the next point that I'll make. He spends too much and borrows too much. That's really ironic because the Republicans, they have painted themselves as the party of fiscal responsibility, if you will. And with Republicans in control of the House, the Senate, the presidency, they added over $1 trillion to the deficit in 1 year after pretending to be deficit hawks the whole time Obama was in office. So things Obama wanted to do that he thought would help the country, they didn't want to do because it's him spending too much. It's him borrowing too much. But they get into power and they have well over $1 trillion to gift to the rich and to corporations. So, well, people might say, "Oh, you're taking the quote about making Obama a one-term president being the most important thing they want to accomplish out of context." I say, am I? Am I taking that out of context? This man is blatantly hypocritical and I think craves power above all else. Moving on, let's talk about Russian interference and McConnell's response to that. So the Russians, based on the intelligence community, not just some random internet bloggers, but based on the CIA, FBI, interfered in our elections, the bedrock of our democracy, to try to help Trump win and put a Republican in Trump in power. So three things on that. First thing I'll say is McConnell refused to issue a bipartisan statement with Barack Obama to warn the American people of what was going on, despite reports from the intelligence community. So I'd say that's pretty polarizing when you're not even willing to put your country over your party. But then he goes further. Based on various news reports, McConnell said he would accuse Obama of playing politics and trying to tip the scales towards Hillary if he came out and made a statement. So not only would he not do a bipartisan statement, he said if Obama went ahead and warned the American public of something they clearly deserved to know, he would accuse Obama of playing politics. Last thing I'll say on the Russian interference front and McConnell is then, after many bills had been introduced to try to protect Mueller's investigation, there's been a complete refusal on the Republican side and on Mitch McConnell's part to take any of these bills up and actually protect the Mueller probe. So there's an assault on our democracy, pretty much, not pretty much, there's cyber war being waged against the United States, and due to blind party loyalty, McConnell won't won't meet Obama in the middle, won't meet the Democrats in the middle, won't meet America in the middle, despite him saying that he wanted Obama to do that for him when he was president. So now I want to back up a little bit and go back to pre-World War II Europe, and you'll see the point that I'm making shortly. So there was So in terms of the rise of fascism and Hitler, there was divisions. So those are far right movements. Like Hitler. That's an example of an extremely far right authoritarian dictator. But what led to this? We talked about the hyperpolarization. We talked about Hindenburg and things like that. But I want to talk about divisions on the left in pre-World War II Europe among like the communists, the socialists, and all of those various factions. So there was a man named Leon Blum who was a Jewish socialist, and he was running at some point to be the head of the French government. And the French, they didn't want a government headed by Blum for whatever reason that was. And many French said better Hitler than Blum. And what they meant by this is, of course, France wasn't part of Germany, but what they meant was rather than Blum, we want someone who more emulates Hitler. In other words, they did not desire to unite against fascism. Those in the center or on the left, they didn't desire or they didn't do enough to unite against fascism. So, you know, it comes Browning comes to this conclusion that if they said better Hitler than Blum, is there a point where in America people on the right say better Putin than Hillary? Hillary becomes so demonized that no matter what Mueller's report finds, that okay, it was justified, better Putin than Hillary, essentially. I mean, if the right side of the political spectrum, Trump's base in the modern day US has not been shaken by anything Trump has done so far, what will they allow? If it's found that Trump sold out our democracy, which a lot of facts point to this being a greater possibility, and that those facts grow by the day, will it come down to a better Putin than Hillary type of attitude? We already have been going in this direction. Many on the right have simply been convinced it doesn't matter what Trump does. Right-wing propaganda, such as Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, things that if Hillary did them or Obama did them, that they would have crucified those people for. Doesn't even matter. Trump's lawyer can plead guilty to felonies and implicate Trump as an unindicted co-conspirator. His campaign manager can be sent to jail for being a foreign agent and a whole bunch of other charges, including fraud and all sorts of charges involving money, but just blatant corruption all over the board. And if it was any other politician, especially any other Democratic politician, they'd be foaming at the mouth, and it would have been past time for impeachment and removal. So, I mean, it pretty much comes down to when push comes to shove, will Republicans led by McConnell wake up and say, let's say theoretically when Mueller's report is issued, will they wake up and say Mueller's report is damning, it's comprehensive, and Trump has to go? I don't know. Or will they continue to bury their heads in the sand? Will they ignore any criminal wrongdoing at all costs to achieve their goals? Will they ultimately say, as some of the French said, better Hitler than Blum or Bloom? Will they ultimately say better Putin than Hillary, better Russia than a Democrat? So that's where this polarization leads us to. So, and the scariest thing is, I think that based on the actions of many congressional Republicans, based on McConnell's actions, since Trump has became president, or even since he became the Republican nominee, it's going to be the latter. They're not going to wake up. They're going to continue to defend this man almost at all costs. And that is a truly scary proposition. And it's just like Hindenburg and Hitler. They were happy with their policy goals. They were getting things done that they wanted to get done. And then the Nazis took it a step further. So is that what's happening here in the United States today? Is there enablers such as Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and people of their ilk who, once Trump became the nominee, they put their eggs in that basket and said, lower taxes, repealing Obamacare, that's so important. We don't care what a dangerous demagogue could do to this nation. And I think that's exactly what's happened. They've decided to sell their country out to enable, much like Hindenburg did with Hitler, they've sold their country out to enable a president simply because he aligned with them on some ideological issues. And that is very dangerous. When you're putting party over country, as they have repeatedly done since Trump became the nominee, it's a very, very dangerous route to go. So that concludes my video for today. Please click subscribe. It will be the donkey and elephant symbol at the bottom of your screen, and make sure to follow me on Twitter at JasonB Politics. My next video, I plan on tackling voter suppression. There's been some pretty blatant examples of it leading up to the 2018 midterms. Thank you all.